She is 20 years old. She has been convicted of 2 counts of aggravated murder. She has been sentenced to a minimum of 15 years in a state correctional facility. She will not be eligible for parole consideration until she is in her 30s, if then. And yet watch her hands, they are still. Watch her voice, it does not shake. Watch her eyes meeting the camera with something that reads less like remorse and more like strategy. On the morning of July 31st, 2022, a car traveling at 69 miles per hour in a 35-mile-per-hour zone drove directly into the side of that building. There were no skid marks, no screeching tires, no evidence that the driver had done what any driver, in any emergency, in any moment of panic or accident, would have done. She never touched the brakes. 2 people were killed. Dominic Russo, 18 years old, her boyfriend. Davon Flanagan, also 18, their friend. Both gone before the dust had settled. The driver survived. I'm not a monster. I'm not saying I'm innocent. I was a driver of a tragedy, but I'm not a murderer. Those words were spoken not in a courtroom, not under oath, not before a judge who had already reviewed every piece of evidence. They were spoken into a camera, for an audience of millions, as part of a carefully managed public relations effort to do what 3 years of legal appeals have so far failed to accomplish: get Mackenzie Shirilla out of prison. Here is what makes this case unlike almost any other you have encountered. It is not a mystery. The facts of what happened on that road are not in dispute. The black box data from her car confirmed the acceleration. Forensic analysis found no mechanical failure. Toxicology showed no meaningful level of intoxication. There was no sudden medical episode on record. There was no other car. There was no ice, no blowout, no animal in the road. A Cuyahoga County judge, not a jury, a judge, someone who has spent a career weighing evidence, reviewed every piece of testimony, every exhibit, every argument from both sides, and found Mackenzie Shirilla guilty of intentionally killing 2 human beings. That verdict has survived every legal challenge her team has brought against it. And still she is fighting. Her family is fighting. A Netflix documentary has aired. A social media campaign has been mounted. Appeals have been filed, argued, and lost. A petition to the Ohio Supreme Court is pending. Meanwhile, in a house somewhere in Ohio, a sister named Christine gets up every morning and carries the weight of a brother who is not coming back. She does not get appeals. She does not get second chances before the court of public opinion. She gets a podcast, a petition, and the particular, relentless grief of someone who watched a killer become a cause. This is the story of Mackenzie Shirilla, of Dominic Russo, of the 1.8 seconds on a July morning that separated 2 lives from their futures, and of the years since, in which one young woman has fought with every resource available to her to rewrite what those 1.8 seconds mean. Let's go back to the beginning, not the beginning of the legal battle, not the beginning of the media campaign, the actual beginning. The morning of July 31st, 2022, Strongsville, Ohio, a Sunday. Mackenzie Shirilla was 17 years old. Dominic Russo was 18. Davon Flanagan was 18. By all accounts, the 3 of them had spent time together the night before, moving through the ordinary rhythms of teenagers in summer, late hours, easy company, the particular freedom of a season with no school and nowhere urgent to be. At some point in the early hours of that Sunday morning, the 3 of them got into Shirilla's car. Shirilla was behind the wheel. What happened next took less than 2 seconds to unfold and has taken years to fully reckon with. The car accelerated, not gradually, not erratically, with purpose. It reached 69 miles per hour on a road with a posted limit of 35. It did not slow. It did not swerve. It drove directly in a straight line into the side of a brick building. The black box, the event data recorder embedded in the vehicle, captured everything: the acceleration, the speed, and the absence of braking. In the entire sequence leading up to impact, Shirilla never applied the brakes. Not once. Not for a fraction of a second. There is no data point, no sensor reading, no technical footnote anywhere in the forensic record that suggests she tried to stop. Dominic Russo died at the scene. Davon Flanagan died at the scene. Mackenzie Shirilla survived. Investigators combed through every alternative explanation available to them. Mechanical failure ruled out. The car was functioning normally. Sudden medical incapacitation, no prior medical history on record, no diagnosis disclosed, no evidence of a condition that would cause it. Intoxication severe enough to explain the behavior, toxicology did not support it. Another vehicle, an obstruction, an external factor of any kind, nothing. The road was clear. The building was stationary. The only variable that morning was the driver. The case moved quickly. Given her age, 17, there was an immediate legal question about jurisdiction. Ohio law on this point, however, is not ambiguous. Murder is a mandatory bindover offense. It does not matter how old the accused is. If the state can establish probable cause that a murder occurred, the case transfers to adult court. The state established it without difficulty. Shirilla would be tried as an adult. The trial took place before a judge, not a jury, a bench trial, where the weight of the evidence falls entirely on one person's interpretation. That person was Judge Brendan Sheehan of the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas. He heard everything: the black box data, the forensic analysis, the testimony about the relationship between Shirilla and Russo, the prior incidents, the statements she made in the aftermath. He weighed all of it, and on August 14, 2023, he found Mackenzie Shirilla guilty on all counts. 2 counts of aggravated murder, 1 count of murder, 1 count of felonious assault. Then came sentencing. There are moments in a courtroom that carry a specific, irreversible weight. Not the verdict is the conclusion of an argument. Sentencing is different. Sentencing is the moment the argument ends and the reality begins. It is the moment a number attaches itself to a life. For Mackenzie Shirilla, that number was 15. 15 years to life. She would not be eligible for parole consideration until she had served a minimum of 15 years in an Ohio correctional facility. She was, at the time of sentencing, 18 years old. She would be at least 33 before anyone with the authority to release her would even consider doing so. Accounts of the moment describe a young woman visibly stunned. Whatever she had anticipated, a lighter sentence, a suspended term. Some version of leniency extended to someone who had no prior criminal record and who had, at least publicly, presented herself as a grieving participant in a tragedy rather than its architect. It was not this. The composure she has maintained in every interview since, the careful stillness of the young woman who sits across from cameras and speaks in measured, lawyerly phrases, was apparently not present in that courtroom. She heard 15 years to life, and the shock was visible. That moment, the gap between what she expected and what she received, is in many ways the true beginning of everything that follows. Every appeal, every interview, every petition, every Netflix documentary, everything her family has said in public, everything her legal team has argued before the courts, every post on social media, every podcast episode, every Supreme Court filing, all of it flows directly from that moment of stunned disbelief in a Cuyahoga County courtroom. She did not accept it. She has not accepted it since. Think about that for a moment. Not the sentence itself, but the refusal to accept it. Because here is what is worth sitting with. Every person who has ever been wrongly convicted has also refused to accept their sentence. Refusal by itself proves nothing. It is neither evidence of innocence nor evidence of guilt. What matters, what the rest of this story will ask you to weigh, is what the refusal is built on. Is it built on facts the court got wrong? Or is it built on the simple, human unwillingness to accept that the facts the court got right have consequences? That is the question Shirilla's entire post-conviction campaign has been, consciously or not, trying to answer. And it is the question we are going to follow, through the appeals courts, through the Netflix cameras, through a family's unshakable belief, and through the grief of a sister who has been watching all of it from the other side of a wall that no legal filing will ever fully breach. But before we get to the campaign, we need to understand what she is actually up against. Because the record that Judge Sheehan built, the evidentiary foundation on which this conviction rests, is not thin. It is not a circumstantial case held together by inference and assumption. It is a case built, brick by deliberate brick, from evidence that the appellate courts have now examined multiple times and declined to disturb. To understand why every appeal has failed, you first need to understand what the prosecution proved and how. The black box data established speed and the absence of braking, but speed alone does not prove intent. A person can drive recklessly without intending to kill. A person can make a catastrophically bad decision in a moment of impaired judgment without harboring a specific plan to end someone's life. The prosecution knew this, so did the defense. The question of intent, the question of what was inside Mackenzie Shirilla's mind in the seconds before impact, was always going to be the center of the case. And to answer it, the prosecution reached back, not to the morning of July 31st, but to the weeks before it, to a pattern of behavior that, once introduced into the record, reframed the crash not as a sudden, inexplicable event, but as the endpoint of something that had been building. 2 weeks before the crash, on July 17, 2022, there had been an incident on a highway. Shirilla and Dominic were in the car together, arguing. According to accounts presented at trial, Shirilla threatened to crash the car with him inside it. Not metaphorically, not in the hyperbolic way that people sometimes speak in the heat of an argument. She threatened, specifically, to use the car as a weapon against the person sitting next to her in it. There were also recorded phone calls, apparently captured by Dominic himself, the significance of which only became clear after his death. In those recordings, Shirilla's voice can be heard threatening to key his car if he did not let her in. There were accounts of her showing up at his door, pounding on it, screaming. Former classmates described a young woman known for explosive, disproportionate reactions, someone who had, on at least one occasion, kicked Dominic out of her car on a highway during a fight. People who knew her described a volatility around him, specifically that stood apart from how she presented in other contexts. All of this evidence, the prior threats, the recorded calls, the testimony about the nature of the relationship, was admitted under Ohio Rule of Evidence 404(b). That rule allows prior acts to be introduced not to prove that someone is generally a bad person, but to prove something specific: intent, motive, the absence of accident or mistake. Shirilla's legal team fought hard to keep it out. They lost, and once it was in, the picture it created was not of a teenager who made a terrible mistake in a moment of impaired judgment. It was of a teenager who had, within the preceding 2 weeks, made almost the exact same threat that she then, on the morning of July 31st, carried out. Judge Sheehan found her guilty. The sentence was 15 years to life. And in that courtroom, a young woman who had apparently believed, truly believed, that none of this would end the way it did, heard a number that would define the next chapter of her life, and decided, in whatever way such decisions are made in moments of shock and disbelief, that she was not done fighting. When the legal system closes a door, some people sit in the dark. Mackenzie Shirilla and her team opened a window and invited the entire world to look through it. The decision to participate in a Netflix documentary was not an accident, and it was not an act of transparency. It was a calculated move, made by people who understood something important about the modern media landscape. That public sympathy, cultivated carefully and distributed at scale, can create a kind of pressure that courtrooms are not supposed to feel but sometimes do. That a face on a screen, humanized and articulate and young, can accomplish things that legal briefs cannot. That the court of public opinion, while it has no jurisdiction, has influence, and influence over time has a way of finding its way into rooms where decisions are made. So Shirilla sat down in front of a camera for the Netflix documentary titled, with blunt simplicity, the crash. And she spoke, carefully, deliberately, with the cadence of someone who has spent considerable time thinking about exactly which words to use and in exactly which order to deploy them. "I'm not a monster. I'm not saying I'm innocent. I was a driver of a tragedy, but I'm not a murderer." Notice the architecture of that sentence. She does not say she is innocent. She is careful to avoid a claim the record cannot support. She does not say the crash was not her fault. She acknowledges being the driver. What she does, with surgical precision, is insert distance between herself and the word that the court applied to her. Not a murderer, a driver of a tragedy, the language of accident, the grammar of misfortune rather than malice. She spoke about Dominic. She described their relationship in terms that were, depending on your vantage point, either genuinely tender or strategically deployed. "We would have probably been married by now," she said. It is the kind of statement that lands very differently based on what you already believe about her. If you believe she is a grieving young woman who made a catastrophic mistake, it reads as heartbreak. If you believe she is a convicted murderer managing her public image, it reads as a line rehearsed for maximum sympathy. The documentary does not tell you which reading is correct. It cannot. What it can do is show you the statement and ask you to sit with it. And then, near the end of the interview, came the moment that undid much of what the rest of it had carefully constructed. The cameras were still rolling. Shirilla appeared to turn not fully away, not with the awareness that the microphone was still live, and said, in a voice not quite meant for the audience, to someone near her attorney, "I really want to be big on the no intent, the no intent." 7 words, 1 sentence caught on film. Legal observers who reviewed the footage were not kind in their assessment. What that moment revealed, or appeared to reveal, was not a young woman processing grief and searching for the right language to express a complicated truth. It was a young woman managing a narrative, reminding herself or someone near her of the throughline she needed to maintain. The no-intent framing was not an organic expression of her experience. It was, in that moment, visible as a talking point. A legal strategy wearing the costume of emotion. For anyone who had been watching the interview with an open mind, wondering whether the carefully worded answers reflected genuine feeling or careful construction, that moment answered the question. And it answered it in a way that no amount of subsequent media appearances could fully walk back. The clip traveled. It spread across social media, was dissected in true crime communities, was cited by legal commentators. People who had been sympathetic found themselves reassessing. People who had already formed a negative view felt confirmed. And somewhere in an Ohio correctional facility, a young woman had handed her critics the most damaging piece of evidence against her public campaign. Not from a prosecutor, not from a judge, but from her own mouth on her own terms, in a documentary she had agreed to participate in. Her family, to their credit, has never wavered. Whatever the documentary revealed, whatever the courts decided, the people who raised Mackenzie Shirilla have maintained with absolute consistency that she is innocent, and more specifically, that she was medically incapacitated at the wheel on the morning of July 31st. The argument rests on a diagnosis, POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. It is a real condition. It affects the autonomic nervous system, specifically the body's ability to regulate heart rate and blood pressure when a person moves from lying down to standing or experiences sudden changes in posture. In severe cases, it can cause dizziness, fainting, and a sudden, involuntary loss of consciousness. The family's position is that Shirilla suffered from this condition, that it was undiagnosed or undisclosed at the time, and that what appeared to be deliberate acceleration into a brick building was in fact the result of a sudden blackout, her foot on the accelerator, unconscious, unable to respond, while the car carried Dominic and Davon toward a wall she could not see. It is, as a theory, not impossible. POTS is a real diagnosis. Sudden incapacitation behind the wheel is a real phenomenon. There are documented cases of drivers losing consciousness and causing accidents with no criminal intent whatsoever. But here is what the record shows. No medical expert was ever called at trial to substantiate the POTS diagnosis. No prior medical records were produced that documented the condition. No physician's notes, no prescription history, no record of prior episodes. No evidence that Shirilla had ever reported to a doctor, a school nurse, a parent, or anyone in an official capacity that she experienced blackouts, dizziness, or any symptom consistent with a disqualifying autonomic condition. Her driving history contained no disclosures of a medical condition that would affect her fitness to operate a vehicle. The POTS argument was not made to the trial court with expert testimony. It was not supported by the kind of medical documentation that would allow a court to evaluate it seriously. It was advanced, and continues to be advanced, as a family's belief, expressed with conviction and love, but without the evidentiary foundation that a court of law requires before it can be treated as anything other than an alternative explanation offered after the fact. And courts, as we are about to see in considerable detail, respond only to what is in the record. Here is something worth asking yourself as we move into the legal portion of this story. Shirilla's family believes in her innocence completely. That belief is not cynical. It is not performative. These are people who love her and who have organized their lives around the possibility that a terrible wrong was done to her by the justice system. But belief, however sincere, is not the same as evidence. And the question the appellate courts have been asked to answer is not whether her family believes she is innocent. It is whether the trial court made a legal error serious enough to overturn a guilty verdict. Those are two entirely different questions, and as we are about to see, the answer to the second one has been, every single time, no. 3 years, multiple courts, every argument available under Ohio law, and not one of them has moved the needle by a single degree. Let's walk through exactly why. The first argument her legal team brought to the appellate court was the one about jurisdiction, the argument that she should never have been tried as an adult in the first place. It is, on its surface, a sympathetic argument. She was 17. The juvenile system exists precisely to handle young offenders differently from adults, to account for the developmental reality that adolescent brains are not fully formed, that adolescent decisions are not made with adult judgment, and that the purpose of juvenile adjudication is rehabilitation rather than punishment. But Ohio law does not leave this to judicial discretion when the charge is murder. The bindover to adult court is mandatory. The only threshold the state must meet is probable cause, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, not a full evidentiary hearing on the merits. Just probable cause that a murder occurred and that this person committed it. That threshold was met before the trial began. The argument failed. The second argument challenged the sufficiency of the evidence. This is the argument that says, even if you accept everything the prosecution presented, it still does not add up to proof beyond a reasonable doubt that she intended to kill. The appellate court looked at the same evidence Judge Sheehan had looked at: the speed, the absence of braking, the July 17th highway incident, the recorded phone calls, the testimony about the relationship, and reached the same conclusion. It was sufficient. More than sufficient, the argument failed. The third argument was a manifest weight challenge, a claim that the judge simply got it wrong, that the weight of the evidence tilted against conviction rather than toward it. The standard for overturning a verdict on manifest weight grounds is extraordinarily high. It is reserved for cases where the evidence is so one-sided in the defendant's favor that to uphold the conviction would be a miscarriage of justice. This was not that case. The argument failed. The fourth argument, and the most fiercely contested, was the fight over the 404B evidence, the prior incidents, the July 17th threat on the highway, the recorded calls, the testimony about Shirilla's behavior around Dominic. Her team argued that all of it should have been excluded, that its only effect was to paint her as a person of bad character, and that its admission had unfairly prejudiced the outcome. The court disagreed. The prior acts were not admitted to show that she was a bad person. They were admitted to show intent, to establish that the crash on July 31st was not a first instance of erratic behavior, not a sudden aberration with no context, but a pattern with a specific prior expression. 2 weeks before the fatal crash, she had made almost the exact same threat. That prior threat was directly relevant to the question of whether the crash was accidental or intentional. The argument failed. 4 arguments, 4 defeats. Each one considered, each one rejected, each one leaving Shirilla's legal position slightly more constrained than it had been before. And then came the mistake that closed a door her own team had been relying on. The post-conviction petition, the legal mechanism through which convicted defendants can raise claims that were not available at trial, including claims of ineffective assistance of counsel, has a filing deadline. In Ohio, that deadline is 365 days from the date the trial transcripts are filed. It is a jurisdictional deadline, which means it is not flexible. It cannot be waived. It cannot be extended by goodwill or extenuating circumstances. Shirilla's legal team filed their post-conviction petition 1 day late. They argued the clock should have started from a different date, from when the juvenile court transcripts were filed rather than the criminal trial transcripts. The court disagreed. They floated a leap year argument, suggesting the calendar calculation had been mishandled by 1 day because of how the intervening year was counted. The court rejected that too. 1 day, the mechanism that exists specifically to argue that legal representation was inadequate, the very argument that might have given Shirilla's team the most meaningful remaining pathway, was lost because of a calendar error made by the legal representatives themselves. The irony sits in the record, quiet and devastating, available for anyone who reads the filings to find. Which brings us to where the case stands now, with one door still technically open barely and by the thinnest of margins. The Ohio Supreme Court, which had already declined once to take the case, and which Shirilla's team has approached again, this time with an argument centered on the specific hours before the crash. The claim that the state failed to prove she harbored animosity toward the victims in that particular window of time, that the relationship was warm that evening, that the night before the crash does not match the profile of someone building toward a calculated act of violence. Peer testimony was gathered. Descriptions of the final hours the three of them spent together were assembled. The argument was made that motive, the broader pattern of the relationship, had been conflated with intent, which must be proven in the specific moment of the act, not inferred from the general character of the months before it. It is not a frivolous argument. It is the strongest remaining argument available, but it faces a significant counter-record. Classmates who describe explosive road rage, the prior highway incident, the nickname her peers gave her, Baby Kush, offered not as flattery but as a shorthand for someone they understood to be volatile. The state filed its own memorandum arguing the Supreme Court need not take the case at all. As of now, the Supreme Court has not ruled. The last door remains technically open, but it is a door held ajar by a sliver of light in a building where every other exit has been sealed, some by the courts, and at least one, irreversibly, by the people she is counting on to get her out.